my friends. Years ago, when I first got started in this futures business, I was spent a lot of time trying to kind of work my way across the horizon, trying to understand what the major kind of forcing functions were that are likely to kind of fundamentally shape the future. and Early on, as a matter of fact, I first kind of got engaged in this back in 1984, 5 or so. I was doing a big study with a friend of mine, and we were feeding the output up to Colin Powell, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time, and we were trying to anticipate what the kind of the basic environment or for national security might be in the next 5 to 7 years. And I remember specifically when the whole environmental thing kind of just collapsed on top of my head one day, because the reality of it all just became obvious and you could just see it coming downstream. And so the whole business of climate change is such as I've been thinking of for a long time. And back then, I was running around the world a good bit, giving speeches different places, and so I'd always have a significant kind of component in my talks about what was then the kind of the common perspective about what's going on in the terms of the climate. And back then, I had some wonderful graphics about how the world was rising, the temperature is going up, and it was getting to the peak, and then it was going to go down the other side of this kind of metaphorical mountain, and it would, blow, everything would get blown up. I had a video, I had a slide that showed what the rises in the ocean level would be like. And I had different cities in the United States, and kind of superimposed over the kind of the aerial view of the city, it would show the areas that would be underwater if this all kept going. And I remember one particularly from Seattle, to where all of the downtown area in Seattle and everything are all under 3 feet of water or some other kind of thing in a relatively short period of time. The current trends and the models were correct in telling what was going on in terms of climate change. So I was a real believer, and and I felt this deep kind of emotional connection with the kind of stuff that was going on. Was flying out to LA on a fairly regular basis, and back then, boy, I remember that the pollution was so bad that your throat would be raspy and raw, and you couldn't see half a mile in front of you some evenings when you were out there driving down the freeways. And so it was really kind of in your face and pretty obvious. I remember we we went back during that period. We went to China. Government in China invited me to come out and bring my family. And for 2 weeks, they took us all over China and showed us all over the place. And we took a ride down the Yangtze River in a boat. I've never seen so much pollution on a river in my life. It was amazing, the trash, and you'd go by these factories, and they'd have these pipes that were this big around that were just having this fluorescent green stuff shooting off into the river, and you knew, and there was foam all over the top of the river, and oh, it was just galvanizing. I mean, and you can't get away. You can't see those kinds of things and not being impressed that humans are doing a lot of damage to different areas on the planet. And so I was very sensitive to that and used to go around giving all the speeches about it. And I was really convinced of all of this. And at the time, I had a friend of mine who was the administrator of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And NOAA, of course, is the major kind of climatological and meteorological organization. Although I think commerce, it's inside of commerce. And so, yeah. And my friend was a retired Navy 3-star admiral, Connie Laudenbacher. And so I used to go over there every 3 months. I'd go over and have lunch with him. And I remember going in there to talk to him one day. And I said, Connie, man, there's just all these, look at what's going to happen. And we're all going to be underwater and the temperature is going to go all up. And he said, John, you got to understand that the models that they use for these predictions had no provisions for aerosols up to 5 years ago. And I sat there and thought about it for about 6 beats. Aerosols, well, those are clouds, right? The models had no provisions for clouds, up to, till, into the 1980s. And all of these dire projections that they were making were all built around models that were simplistic. And that made me start to say, well, wait a second, maybe these guys are not right. Or maybe there's something else in play here. I was still, well, I was a lot naive about how science works back then and how the whole kind of mechanism of how things got decided in terms of experiments and funding and other such things. And I presumed, probably up until then, that the scientists were pretty honest, and that if there was one place that you could go back to and that you could trust, it had to be scientists. By the time it gets into technology, then they could be doing any number of other kind of things. Then that wouldn't be good for humanity. But the scientists, they were kind of honest. And then I started looking into this stuff, and I knew a lot of people who were very kind of leaders in the whole climate change movement. The guys who were run the Rocky Mountain Institute were dear friends of mine, and any number of other kind of places that, and I believed in all of this stuff, but I started to do some kind of research outside of outside of what was coming out of the United Nations. And I found out some interesting things. And I remember back there in the mid 80s when I was first starting to run around Washington. and I was involved in the military reform movement. That there was a guy that was involved in the military reform movement named Pierre Sprey. And Pierre Sprey was famous in kind of national security terms because Pierre Sprey had been the inventor of the F-16 airplane and the A-10 and the F-15, as it turns out. And so he was part of this little mafia within the Air Force that was trying to do unconventional design of fighter aircraft and such. And so, um, uh, and anybody who knows anything about fighters will tell you the F-15 or 16 is the finest, most agile fighter ever, and Pierre designed that. And I remember one day when this whole global warming business and this anthropogenic notion of humans causing global warming was starting to fly around. Somebody mentioned this to Pierre, and Pierre says, kind of just instantaneously, says, that's absurd. If you know anything at all about the relative sizes of the energetics and the forcing functions and on this planet, what you know is that the effect that humans have on the atmosphere and everything are so minuscule compared to the other major forces in play, including, of course, the sun. And so for the first time, I saw somebody who had a background of very serious kind of inventions and creativity and a deep understanding of science, who's saying, no, the fundamentals are wrong. And then I had another airplane designer friend who I still see once a year. I have lunch with, Burt Rutan. And Burt Rutan, at that point and throughout most of my adult life, was the most famous airplane designer on the planet, and has designed all kinds of things. An airplane that flew nonstop all around the world for the first time, and the Voyager, and the X Prize. The winner of the X Prize of the first rocket to go up to twice in 2 weeks and use the returnable. That Burt designed all of that. And Burt, at some point, late in the 80s, maybe some early in the 90s or something, we got very interested in climate change, and gave a year and a half of his time to systematically studying what this was all about and how it all worked. Now, Burt used to like to say, well, there's a fundamental difference between science and engineers. And that is that if engineers are wrong, nobody remembers. And if scientists are wrong, nobody remembers. But if engineers are wrong, they go to jail. Because the fact of the matter is that scientists pontificate and have all these theories and other stuff in published papers, but seldom, when they are proven wrong 10 or 20 or 30 years later, or whatever it turns out to be, does there any repercussions that come back to them. Engineers, on the other hand, if the bridge breaks, or the building collapses, or the other kind of things that are the product of engineering design, well, then the first one they go to is to find the design engineer, and they can literally put them in prison for having done faulty design. And so engineers have a different and far more objective approach to things, and they have no agenda per se. That is to say, they look at the data and they say, "What is this telling me?" Scientists, on the other hand, have a hypothesis, and they go in saying, "I wonder, we think that it might work this way," and then they look at the data to try to find out if it confirms their hypothesis or not. And they would really like it to confirm their hypothesis because, of course, that's the kind of point that they're trying to make, the way to explain how reality, that their little piece of reality works. And so they have this kind of built-in bias, this agenda toward trying to shoehorn the data into their kind of model of how they think things work. That's not how engineers work at all. Engineers are very careful I mean, a zillion ways they can get killed, whether you're an electrical engineer, or a civil engineer, or a mechanical engineer, or any kind of engineering, process engineer, shoot, aeronautical. All of them, if you just think about it for a minute, are all in the business of trying to do really advanced design and creativity with ways that predictably do not kill somebody or injure anybody, because their life and livelihood would be at stake. And so Burt spent a year and a half just systematically going through all of the data and looking at all this stuff and trying to make sense of it. And what he found out was, and this is the subject of a 2.5 hour lecture that he used to run around the country giving, with something like 350 slides. What he discovered was that that all of the original data that had been generated back before 1970s, before the IPCC, the International, the I don't know, climate thing. It's the multi-country. I forget what the acronym stands for. But what you found out was that as they developed, starting, if I remember right, about 1974, they started manipulating the data. I mean, literally going back, because they had this agenda. You remember the hockey stick thing? Michael Mann, I think, was the guy who came up with that. I literally put that in my first book because I really thought that this was important and compelling, and that we ought to do something about it. And then you go back, and then they had this kind of email breach where somebody hacked into their emails and found out that they were all talking about how they had to change the data in order to make it to conform to, what they had proposed and their theories and so on and everything. And I remember early on looking at the curves and from the ice corings at the Vostok up on in Greenland, where they did the deep ice corings, and then down in Antarctica. And they had plotted the curve about going back 400,000 years, plotting how the CO2 had changed and how the temperature had changed. And when you looked at those two together, what you could see is that clearly that the CO2 had changed about on the average of 400 to 800 years after the temperature change. So the temperature goes up, and then the CO2 goes up, and so on. Not the other way around, that the CO2 was not driving the temperature was driving the CO2 changes. And I started talking about that and writing about it and stuff. And I don't think it's because of what I was doing or anything, but about 3 years later, when you went back to look at those curves, they had changed them. They had moved them back to show that CO2 came up first rather than, I mean, they manipulated the data. And what Burt found out is that all across the planet in different places, they had gone back and that you could find the original data that said, here's what the temperature was. And then then when they started publishing this stuff, later on, they had gone down and added 20 degrees everywhere on the whole thing and driven the whole thing up to make it look like it was hotter than it was. It was just a host of those things, just a bunch of them. And it was really, the whole process was crooked, and it continues to be to a great extent now. It was aggravated by the fact that none of the real life did not mimic any of the models. So there were maybe a dozen different climate models, and they all had stuff going up to the sky, right? And none of it happened. I mean, when you then plotted what happened on the actual temperature, then there's a thing came out from the British Meteorological Association, or whatever it's called, the Met, they call it. And it showed that for the last 16 years, the temperature on the planet had remained the same. And then you started to get these things out of these satellites that were doing measurement of the sea level. And they started saying, well, the average sea level increase has been, like 2 millimeters a year for the last century. And at that rate, you can go 100 years and the level of the sea level, if it continued for 100 years, you'd have something under a foot, a rise in sea level. And, it was none of this 6-foot high kind of inundation that everybody was talking about. And you finally you start saying, wait a second, this whole system, this whole process is compromised. And of course, you could go and find, and that's when I then figured out how funding of science and research worked in this country. And that is that the National Science Foundation, driven by whatever the agenda in the White House was at the time, would only fund those things that were consistent with whatever the political perspective in the White House was, whether it was a Republican or Democrat. And if you're a scientist down the food chain trying to figure out how to keep your laboratory and all your people were working and everything, you know how to put your finger into the wind and find out which way the wind blows, and determine what kinds of research are going to get funded and what aren't going to get funded. I mean, that's just kind of human nature, but that's the way it works. And so I learned a great deal from Burt and what his approach to all of this. And Burt's position, and I'm sure that Pierre's and others would generally be, climate changes all of the time, and there's nothing we can do about it. And the notion that humans are doing it is certainly, we trash the planet at different places and different times, but the atmospheric effect of all of this is quite something else. I went to one conference and heard some really bright scientists stand up and say, well, they got it. Hansen, this guy who stood up and started it all. It was a briefing that he gave, testimony to some House committee on whatever, atmosphere or something. Back in 1974, he compared the temperature from two different levels and said, look at the temperature and how the trends are and how up in the atmosphere. And the analysis of this guy says, I mean, that's apples and oranges. I mean, he's got He's got thermal heat and he's got radiant heat. So one number is radiant heat coming from the sun. The other one is thermal heat, which is a whole different kind of heat. And you can't compare the two of them. I mean, they both have the word heat in them, but they're not the same kind of heat. And so the whole basis, the fundamentals of the whole greenhouse kind of argument is questionable, at least from that point of view. So anyway, there were all these different kind of pieces that were all coming together that said, hmm, this is not quite the same thing. And then I started to then change my mind and started to try to find out really how this worked. And I spent, parts of a year and a half myself trying to aggregate all these things together and try to make some sense out of it. And one of the first pieces of video that I put up on the internet back when we first started putting it up was about an hour and 20-minute long video that took a whole lot of these slides from these different people and just showed them all and tried to make the case that the climate was not being driven primarily by humans at all, that it was the primary source driving it all was the sun, and that there was a direct correlation between energy coming off the sun and the kind of climate and what was going on Earth. So, and about then there was a bunch of science coming out of Russia and other kind of places that were pointing to saying that, and by the way, this is not global warming. This is going to go cold, and it's going to be a mini ice age, and it is going to come in a hurry. And back then, I used to say about 2023 is when it's going to start to become clear that this thing is going south. And the best guesses back then, perhaps even now in that regard, was that if you really didn't want to live up near Minnesota or certainly in Canada and anything, because there are places around there that would the snow would never melt, or the ice wouldn't melt all summer long in the middle of this kind of what looked like to be about a 60-year period. And there was some very interesting, compelling science that was showing, past trends and current trends and how that you looked like you were at the beginning of all of that. Well, in any case, it was making the case against the principally humans being the principal force that was driving all of this change. And then, of course, during this period, that is to say humans in general and Americans in particular, started getting our act together in terms of the climate, in terms of the atmosphere. So LA now is one of the cleanest places around when you go to LA. And compared to what it used to be, maybe just 20 years ago or 25 years ago, it's a night and day. And there are none of these horribly polluted places in this country, at least like it used to be. China still has its problems. When we went to China, it was in Xi'an, it was extraordinary. They had in the hotel we were staying at, they had 2 full-time people just in the lobby of this hotel. One of them with a push broom going from one side of the floor to the other end, and then turn around, come back, and then turn around and go back again, because the particulates that were coming out of the air from the power plants, they turned the power plants on at night when nobody could see how much trash they were putting up in the sky. And so you when you go out at night, it'd be like a fog. You couldn't see half a block ahead of you. It was so much pollution. And the other person, by the way, in the lobby was doing all the vertical surfaces on the counters and other kinds of things from one side to the other, from the other all the time, because there was so much trash coming out of the sky, out of the air. A lot of that's gone. I heard I was at gave a talk in Shanghai once, and some guy from the China, Academy of Science of China, a scientist there came and gave a talk, and he said the three biggest things every morning. The premier wakes up, and he's got three things on it. The biggest things on his mind. One of them is a circular economy. How in the world do we get to the place where we provide most of the stuff that we need within the country? And the other one was how do I deal with social disruption? Because at that time, the minister of the interior of China had gotten up just recently and said, well, last year we had 45,000 riots in China, and this year, or 2 years ago, it was 45,000, and this last year it was 65,000, and you had these constant problems across the country of people rising up. The third thing they were concerned about was the environment, because what they'd done is they had denuded, they had cut down all the trees across the Gobi Desert and all this stuff, and the westerly winds had come across there and bring all the sand and the dust and everything, and they drive it into, down into the mainland of China and into Beijing and all the, and so it aggravated all the other kind of stuff. And so they were very concerned about it. And so there's been broad-based concern about this, and there's been a whole lot of changes been there. But but you still have at the basis guys like Martin Armstrong and even Cliff High and others will have come to the conclusion that the kind of the basis, the driving elements of the narrative that is driving so much of the chaos and the destruction and what's going on the planet right now is all based upon the idea that these discredited ideas about that humans are driving all this climate change, and that what we've got to do is kill all of the cows in the Netherlands, and and on and on and on, because and we just destroy the food system, the food production system in the process. But we're doing it all because we're going to somehow have to deal with climate change, as though humans were the ones who were driving it. There's a huge amount of hubris associated with that, to believe rather naively and narrowly that humans are the principal kind of source of driving a system that is so big and so complicated that we don't even begin to understand how it works. And I say that because most recently, I've, and this has been a number of years ago, I ran into this guy on the web called the Ethical Skeptic, ethicalskeptic.com, I guess, or maybe org. The ethical skeptic is an unnamed individual of extraordinary intelligence and art. He's amazingly articulate, and he gives some of his background in kind of general, and he runs businesses and started businesses and consults at very, very high levels, and he's probably some kind of a well-known guy, but he chooses not to make his name public. But he writes these extraordinary treatises on different aspects of science. It's this giant multi-page, deep scientific analysis with all these statistical kind of relationships and probabilities and things, and it's impossible that they're not being counterproductive in just the most fundamental way. And then he is very astute in being able to extract the underlying kind of motivations and where this is going and why it's doing the way it's going. Well, he's done the same thing for climate change. And I just want to. This is interesting because what you're going to hear is a whole bunch of things that you have never heard before. That science and climate scientists and stuff have never ever suggested this to you before. And what it means essentially is that the whole community is captured by the narrative, and they're running off and they just spout and the same old stuff over and over again without ever thinking it, nor being open to any larger kind of possibility, and particularly the possibility that they're wrong. And so let me talk to let me just I just tabbed a couple of things here. So he went through a whole bunch of experiments himself, and then extracted things from papers and experiments that others had done. And this is, I'm not going to try to make the big coherent case that he did, but I want you to hear a couple of things. So he says, just as the entire world was burning fossil fuels at a record depressed rate at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? They shut everything down, right? At a depressed rate. The COVID pandemic was a unique kind of global experiment in shutting down the whole industrialization system on this planet. You remember all the airplanes? They brought the airplanes out of the sky and everything, and so they had a chance. Scientists had a chance to compare the measurements of what it was like before, during, and after this shutdown, and so that you could see what was causing stuff and what wasn't causing stuff. Just as the entire world was burning fossil fuels at a record depressed rate at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, at that same exact time, the planet, ironically, observed its most aggressive CO2 parts per million growth in 45 years, right amidst the annual vernal jump with in the spring. And so you got that? Did you catch that? So you shut the whole system down, but the parts per minute per million of CO2 jumps higher than in 45 years when you shut down the whole system. So clearly, that the humans are not driving this thing. Even more, at the very time as carbon emissions were depressed from June 2018 through the end of 2020, the Earth experienced its hottest year on record. So the amount of carbon going up into the air was the least that it had been forever, for a long time. And yet it was hottest. Even more disconcertingly, our models did not predict this, and we explained it only after the fact through ad hoc apologetic, not deductive science. Did you follow that? That say, so after the fact, you say, oh, yeah, well, that's what happened. It happened this way. And, there was not deductive science. It was an apologetic for their underlying narrative. And so then, there's this one curve that comes back to the point I earlier made. CO2 levels are chasing temperatures by means of an unjustifiable acceleration function. They're accelerating and you can't tell why. And the CO2 is chasing the temperatures. So then here's another one. there's a big argument that says that the increase in the atmospheric temperature is causing the increase in temperature in the ocean. Like if you blow kind of warm air over a 55-gallon drum of water, that somehow you're going to rapidly increase the temperature in the drum of water. It's worse than that, but that's the basic idea. That is to say, it's like putting one drop every hour. You put one little drop of somewhat warmer water into this big thing. So it says, therefore, a reasonable deductive contention can be made that changes in the geothermal and gravitational signal under the oceans, right? The heat signature and the magnetic signature under the oceans are the impetus behind both increases in ocean current speeds as well as a dilation of the annual mean sea level variances globally, okay? What they've found out is that the reason why sea levels are increasing is because the ocean currents are increasing in velocity. And that when the ocean currents go faster, then there's an upwelling that happens. And that's what's the principal thing that's driving the increases of measured kind of sea level rise at certain places on the coast. And so, I mean, did you ever hear about that before? Here's another one. Think about this. What they found is that roughly every 32 years, there was an uptick in the number of significant earthquakes worldwide. The team was puzzled as to the root cause of this cyclicality in earthquake rate. They compared it with a number of global historical data sets and found only one that showed a strong correlation with the uptick in earthquakes. Guess what it was? The correlation was to the slowing of the Earth's rotation. What? You've never heard of that before. And here's the underlying science that says, no, you're getting the Earth's rotation and it changes in the spring, by the way, of every year, and it has a little jump, and that then, it's crazy thing. It says 48% of the global ocean sea surface temperature heat content rise from 1995 to 2023. 48, half of the global sea temperature rise between 1995 and 2023, follow me here, arrived in a mere 3 weeks in 2023. So although far too fast for the atmosphere or man to serve as the cause. Wow. I mean, there's stuff going on here that is just bigger. Like it's kind of like what Pierre Sprey said. Yeah, the relationships of the energetics. There's no way in the world you could do any of it. So you get kind of to the bottom line of all of this. And what he says essentially is that the only thing by orders of magnitude, when you look at the potential heat transfer from air to water and the rate at which that happens, it's impossible to generate temperatures high enough to reflect or to represent the amount of temperature that's coming up in the ocean, because they're measuring increases in ocean temperature. And so what this guy does Because he goes back and says, okay, so what could be the cause that is generating the increases in ocean temperature? Because when the ocean temperature increases, then that influences the atmosphere above it, because there's a whole lot more transfer that goes from liquid to gas than it does from gas to liquid, right? For obvious reasons, if you understand the science. And so what they came to the conclusion is that the major force that so they said when there are these changes in they're small, admittedly, but then when there's changes in the rotation of the earth, what it's doing is that it is moving the the uh connectivity between the rates of change of rotation inside the planet and on the mantle on the outside and the surface. And so when you see those changes, what you're seeing is a slipping between these two levels. And when it slips, as you can imagine, then you get increased volcanoes. You get, because you get rubbing and things break apart. And when you get increased volcanoes, what you get is volcanoes under the ocean, submarine volcanoes that are generate huge amount of heat that are coming up and heating the oceans from below. And they've mapped all these things now, and they can show you how these plumes of heat come up from seamounts and volcanoes. And the final thing is only 20% of the seafloor, an estimated 44,000 seamounts and volcanoes, only 20% do they know anything about. And they've got what they think is 44,000 volcanoes going off, has been mapped. Seamounts seamounts are those pointy things where they had like a lot of hot water, a lot of heat generate and steam and stuff come out of them. Seamounts also play an important role oceanographically and have a greater influence on circulation, which can help scientists better understand the uptake of heat and carbon dioxide in the oceans. I just thought that was just fascinating as can be. It just opens the door into a whole dip, and you just say, what? For 20 years, they've had this same old narrative pitching this whole idea that humans are doing all of this, and now they're trying to dump the whole the economic system and life and killing people and everything else, all based upon this theory that they're pitching. And that's not even how the reality works, which then should bring a little kind of humility into this whole thing, whether it has to do with assessing religion and historical kind of ways in which we've looked at things, or whether it's science, or whether it's medicine, or whether it's politics, or whatever, energy, whatever it turns out to be. There just should be a little reverence for the fact that we really probably, certainly in the main line, we don't understand how a lot of this kind of stuff works. And more importantly, and this is where guys like Martin Armstrong come down, they say, man, you get this one wrong and you really cause a lot of destruction and a lot of pain. And so all I'm saying is that there is a new way to look at all of this, and there are things that you can find about what is really seems to be happening, and not the fake story. And it's really a different story, and it's a different kind of perspective, and a majorly different kind of concept than what we're all being led to believe.